Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Joby. I want to make a little video for you to share an experience I've had over the past 7 years, making the transition from being a classical musician to broadening my perspective a bit and looking into and studying jazz improvisation and improvisational playing in general. And it's been absolutely incredible over the past 7 years. And I'm just going to walk through some ideas and texts for those of you who might be new to the idea of improvisational playing and new to the jazz playing, but maybe have a classical background. I'm going to just offer to you what I've encountered over the past 7 years. And I went about this, I guess, well, you know, I've spent 20 years as an academic. I'm a psychology professor. So I went about this in a very, I would say, academic way. I read and I researched and I spoke with people. And I think right now I'm at the point where I finally feel like I have something to share with others about this process. So I hope this is useful to someone, and for sure there's a lot of opinion and there's a lot of varying approaches, and what I'm offering here is one of an infinitude of possibilities. So this is just what I've discovered, and if it's useful, wonderful. If it's not useful, throw it away. And if there's someone watching this that has other ideas, it's inevitable that there are things that I am leaving out that I have no idea about. Please write to me, and if these are things that I feel will also be worth sharing for other people, I'll share those in the comments. And I'm thankful to get turned on to new ideas myself. So please do that. Again, everyone has their own unique path. And I guess that's a big thing to think about here. When it comes to this thing about improvisation and about jazz, if you're like me and have a formal education in music, you tend to want to approach things this way. It feels very safe to approach these things in this way. And the truth is, some of the best things I've discovered in improvisational playing and improvisational jazz playing are outside of the institution. They're things that are existing more in a master-apprentice approach from teachers, not standardized in an academic way. So I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas here. The first thing I would say about improvisational playing is start broadly. And I have 4 books that I'm going to recommend to you. The first, start with this. It's Stephen Nakmanovich's Free Play. Amazing. Absolutely amazing book. I've read it, I've reread it, and I gave it as gifts. I continue to give it as a gift to so many people. This is the spirit of the endeavor. And I would say, after reading this, go on to Kenny Werner's Effortless Mastery, another incredible book. Free Play is more about improvisation in general. Effortless Mastery is a little more focused on jazz playing, but the principles will put you in spirit. These 2 books are just excellent. As a follow-up, after having read Free Play, Stephen Nakmanovich came out with a second text, I think after 20 years, is The Art of Is. And it's just more good stuff about improvisational living and improvisational music making. So definitely Free Play, I highly recommend. Then Kenny Werner's Effortless Mastery for a more jazz approach, and The Art of Is, again by Stephen Nakmanovich. These are 3 just go-to texts for me. And that's how I would start out, maybe just to know, understanding the approach. because it is quite different from a classical approach. So this is wonderful stuff, these three texts. For actual playing, Kenny Werner published through, in the jazz world, there's this series called the Jamie Aebersold Jazz Series, play-alongs, and they have just become so widespread, and they use a certain system towards improvisation that has become kind of the standard in institutionally taught jazz programs. And out of those volumes, there are many volumes of that method, and it's one of multiple methods, which I'm going to get into shortly. But out of all those methods, Kenny Werner published a book, and this is also called Free Play, and it's a play-along. And the thing that's amazing about this book is it's mostly words. And it has a CD play-along with it, and it's for free improvisation. And free improvisation there are no rules in free improvisation. You just make up completely the rules. You just play completely the rules on your own. This idea of free improvisation is so interesting to me because it transcends any kind of genre such as jazz or classical or popular or contemporary, and it's just about playing whatever comes to you at the moment. It's a very kind of meditative Zen kind of experience, or Taoist experience. I've really had a great time doing free play improv, free blowing on both piano and trombone, and I do little projects on both of these. One, I did an improvisational trombone project in a cave up in the mountains here in the Poconos, and I went in and I just free improved and recorded that and took a video and some photos, and it's just an interesting experience. I've also done a lot of thinking and reading on automatic playing, and I did a project on piano with the automatic playing and getting into some psychology with that, of William James, of Gertrude Stein, automatic writing, things of this nature. And that's been very fun. What's exciting about this is it's so outside of anything I've ever done before. And quite frankly, I'd rather do it than listen to it. This is something to keep in mind. We usually are doing music because we think that someone will want to listen to it. I'm not sure I'd want to listen to it, but there's something in the activity of doing it, the experience of free playing and opening up and listening in the cave to water dripping and responding rhythmically to those water drops, or responding to the harmonies that are echoing off the cave walls, or the visual aspect of the environment. There's something very exciting about doing it. Documenting it, for me, is just to set an example. I have students, and I have other young students and older students and students my age who to turn them on to doing this. Otherwise, they'd have to be there with me. So again, I think a big part of the learning experience, and this is in spirit, I think, with free play, is doing this music not necessarily because you want to listen to it, but because the act of doing it brings you something. It's the experience of making the music. There's in psychology there's something called expressive arts therapy. And in expressive arts therapy, there's a mantra. It's called low technique, high expression. And again, it's about the cathartic, expressive activity of the experience of doing the art work, of whatever it is, painting, in this case, music. On a side note, if you're interested in these kind of things, look into Carl Jung and his writings on active imagination. And Carl Jung is very popular with artistic folks, creative folks. Talking about creativity, look into the Gestalt psychologist, Gestalt research psychologist, that is. Fascinating stuff. So I would suggest, if you're looking for an entrance into the spirit of this kind of doing improvisation in a broadest sense, not jazz improvisation, but just improvisation. These four texts. Now, when getting into jazz improvisation, boy, oh boy, you're going to read so much. You're going to hear so much terminology. You're going to hear all about modes. This is a big thing, modes. You're going to hear about another term, chord scales. You're going to hear about target notes and approach tones and guide tones. And then you're going to hear some very familiar terms if you're a classical musician, like neighboring tones and auxiliary notes and chromatic approach tones and appoggiaturas. You're going to hear about all these things, and you already know what those things are if you study classical music. But it's a bit overwhelming. And this is now getting into more jazz playing. And what I am going to tell you is how I've come to understand this is, firstly, liturgical modes. Let's just unpack that a bit. Okay, liturgical modes. They share some similarities with what is known as modal jazz and also the use of modes in jazz. However, what we study, the liturgical modes in music theory, in classical music theory, is really it's in a different place than the jazz modal scene. And that's largely because when we study modal liturgical modes in classical music, we're talking about pre-functional harmony. So harmony before the 1600s. We're talking about, the music from antiquity up through into the 15 and 1600s, before we had the 12 major and minor scales that we call now functional harmony. When I'm going to go a little more into this, when you hear this term modes, the jazz musicians are using similar terminology, but it's applied in a completely novel way, a way that came about in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so I'm going to unpack that a little bit in a few minutes, but for right now, the book that I have found that is really great for the actual functioning of getting into playing for classical musicians now, that is this book, Improvisation for Classical Musicians. This book introduces, in the lingo of classical theory, that is the common practice era theory, that is accessible for classical musicians, but teaches you a lot of the concepts of jazz musicians. So for jazz, some techniques, as I had mentioned, about the appoggiaturas and the leading tones, and the idea of target notes and approach tones, guide tones, and for 2-5-1 progressions and pentatonic scales and the modes. They're all nicely discussed in this book, and it gives it to you from a very classical musician accessible standpoint. The reason I say this is, as far as accessible, is there's different treatments of things. Like in classical music, we talk about the three forms of a minor scale. So we have natural minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor. In jazz music, the treatment of, say, the melodic minor is different than in classical music. So in classical music, you play the melodic, the raised sixth and seventh degree of the scale ascending, and then you revert to a natural minor descending. That's typically not the practice in jazz. And that's just one example. The big another big change between classical and jazz is in classical and in jazz we both use the Roman numeral system of chord analysis, like 2-5-1 progression, etc., which from the common practice functional harmony ideas of functional harmony. However, in classical music, I never encountered anyone using chord symbols like C7 or F7, things of this nature. We talk about the dominant chord, but the use of chord symbols is much more prevalent in jazz. So to get used to those chord symbols. I remember the first time looking through the charts, and I thought, my goodness, I see dominant chords, I see major chords, I see no minor chords, because you just have a chord symbol. And that was before I understood that there are many different markings for chord symbols. So a little minus sign was used in this particular set of charts, lead sheets for the chord symbol of minor, for a minor chord. And then so I realized that. Then I saw my minor chords. When you want to sit down and play jazz, this is what I would suggest. There are so many different methods and so many different approaches. What I have found most useful is to pair the time period of the music or the style of the music with a certain approach to improvisation. So when I am given a piece of music that is written in functional harmony, okay, let's unpack this term, functional harmony. Those of you who studied classical music theory in school, if you were like me graduating in the 90s, you used a harmony and voice leading textbook, and the one that I used, Carl Schachter, Edward Aldwell and Carl Schachter, it touched on chromaticism by the end of the book, but it was largely on classical, functional harmony, meaning there was a definite key and definite key changes, and that was largely marked by a dominant chord that resolved to a tonic, and that's the hallmark of functional harmony. And then by the end of that textbook, the last few chapters got into chromaticism. But it was really a chromaticism that was more oriented towards like the work of the late 19th century, and then it kind of ended. So this is, and of course, jazz has a language that's 20th century and beyond. So I would suggest getting 2 books to review as a classical musician. If you haven't, the Vincent Persichetti 20th Century Harmony is going to give you a lot of the language in classical music terms that you're going to then see in jazz theory. This is a great book. So I highly recommend this book in preparation for making the transition into jazz. It's going to be helpful. And then this one, Beyond Functional Harmony. Now, what's functional what's post-functional harmony or non-functional harmony? That's when we get into this idea of modal jazz that came about in the 40s, 50s, 60s on up, and became really part of the lexicon by the 70s. And there was a text written by a piano teacher at Juilliard named George Russell. And this is really the text that got everything kicked off into this idea of non-functional harmony. So if you look at a piece of music that's written in modal jazz, which you'll hear, this is like a lot of the stuff from the middle to later Miles Davis, etc. You're not thinking necessarily about functional, tonic, dominant, 2-5-1 progressions, things like that, or in keys. You're thinking more in chords that don't resolve. It's interesting. The music goes somewhere musically, but it doesn't really move in the same way that functional harmony does. Often, like I'm thinking of a tune like Blue and Green, I'm also thinking about Maiden Voyage, Herbie Hancock. This is music that you can play in, and you can't really answer the question, what key am I in? It might be that someone has a system that they can conceptualize it in that way, but largely it's not within the functions of harmony. And that is what's called modal jazz. But the term modal is treated within the liturgical modes as we know them from classical music, and you have a piece that uses a certain mode melodically, and maybe just has like an ostinato bass with rhythm, or a drone kind of bass, and you can stay within a mode that it's in, or you can go out play outside that mode. You can do so many different things harmonically with it. Once you've and that's a distinction between like the jazz of the 30s and the 40s, the swing era. You'd want to just think in keys. You can just think there's clear keys that the pieces are written in, and there's clear key changes, and something that happens in jazz that's doesn't always happen as frequently in classical music, and is like really rapid key changes, going through different keys in a matter of beats sometimes, or 2 measures at a time, or 1 measure at a time, key change to key change to key change. And it's not marked in the score that there's a key change. You have to look at the chord functions and see how they're functioning together. So you might spend 4 bars in the key of B flat, and then go 4 bars in the key of E flat, and then 4 bars in the key of D flat, then 4 bars in the key of C flat, then back to B flat for 4 bars. And to recognize that there's a key change taking place, I find it's just best to think in keys. Think that I'm in this key, now I'm shifting to this key, and now I'm shifting to this key. As long as the piece is in functional harmony, working in keys to me is great. And the reason I tell you this is because there are some methods that are useful, you have to know about them, such as the Ebersol method. And they will actually use a chord scale system. Chord scales means that there's a chord and there's a scale that goes along with the chord. So, for example, a dominant chord, you can play on a dominant chord its corresponding Mixolydian mode, also called a chord scale. And in this approach, you can use that method on these older jazz tunes, these functional harmony jazz tunes, but it requires you to think of a scale for each chord. In my experience, it feels too restrictive. I like thinking in phrases. So if I have a 4-bar phrase that's in one key, I feel more at home feeling that in a key of B flat, rather than thinking of this in individual chord scales with a chord. So, but then when you get to post-functional harmony, modal jazz, such as blue and green, you're going then these knowing what mode or chord scale. You can really use these terms chord scale and mode interchangeably. Knowing which mode to use with each chord is really helpful and really useful for improvising, because you're not thinking in terms of dominant, to tonic. You're thinking in terms of shifting in novel ways from harmony to harmony, and that's modal jazz, and that's where this method of modes. So I really got turned on. I love this. This was recommended to me by my piano teacher when I was a teenager, Paul Schocker. He recommended me John Mahegan's 4-volume system of tonal and rhythmic principles of jazz improvisation, and there's 3 more volumes of this. If you see the forwards by Leonard Bernstein, this is a remarkably intelligent text, and also very accessible for classical musicians, because Mahegan was a professor of piano at Juilliard, and knew how to, and he was a classical musician and knew how to present the jazz lexicon to classical musicians. So I think this is another really great resource. Now, if you want to get essentially into theory, this book is really great. It's Mark Levine's The Jazz Theory book. And he wrote a book on piano jazz, which is also incredible. I'm still working through that one. But this is just on theory. And this is going to present to the classical musician how the jazz musician thinks. I think some general observations about the transition from classical to jazz would be this. Theoretically speaking, in classical music, we use theory to analyze, and in improvisational music, you use theory to create. It's almost like, do you know what's interesting? If you want to know a lot of the techniques for improvisation, get a good musical composition book. And it really tells you how to do thematic development and all the different techniques that you then use in improvisation, in composition class. So in jazz theory, it's really applied and you use it to create. In classical theory, if you're not a composer, you're using it to analyze. And if you're a composer, then you're using that to compose. And composition and improvisation are really the same thing, only in improvisation, you're not editing. You're millisecond to millisecond, letting it unfold. But it's the same techniques. Yeah, there's quite a lot to learn. and I'm only now, after 7 years, just starting to feel like I have some kind of bigger picture. I love thinking in bigger pictures. I'm a theoretical guy. So I'm getting a sense of a big picture. Some of the most useful things that I've done is, number one, pentatonic scales. Get yourself some buddies and meet with them every week and play and learn together. I am fortunate enough to have a group of guys that we get together 2-3 times a week, in the wintertime 3 times a week, and we jam. And I've learned so much. They had much more experience than I had. And so I learned so much from them, and I got turned on to repertoire, and it gave me a chance then to put into practice, both piano and trombone for me, put into practice the things that I've been learning. That is really essential. Another thing, the iReel stuff and the play-along stuff is so great. Like playing with, if you don't have people to play with, or in addition to playing with your friends, backing track stuff is so useful. And listening, just listen to get ideas of what you like to play and where you're finding yourself, what you want to play, what you don't want to get involved in. I'm not into bebop. Bebop's not my thing. However, I love modal jazz, cool jazz. I love free improv, and I love doing the stuff from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the Great American Songbook, the standards. I love that stuff. Bebop doesn't speak to me. I don't really care to listen to it either. However, I'm learning it. I learned some pieces because I think it's good to learn, even if it's not what you prefer. Pentatonic scales. So the thing that really gets you going quickly is pentatonic scales and playing the blues. If you start practicing that, that's a great inroad. Pentatonic scales, learning the blues. And then, of course, it's been helpful to practice and study and learn modes and the associated chords that go with the modes. That's been very helpful. So I sit down every morning at the piano and I play the corresponding mode with the corresponding key. That's all stuff you're going to find in the Mohegan book, the John Mohegan book, and also in the Aebersold stuff. again, finding the technique that fits with the style of the tune has been useful for me. Understanding the difference between functional harmony and modal harmony, or functional harmony and non-functional harmony. Understanding those differences are very helpful, because in the beginning I was trying to use functional harmony to analyze pieces that were modal, and it didn't make sense, and I had to discover why it didn't make sense. Yeah. So I hope this has gone on long enough. So I hope that this is useful to someone out there. And again, I want to know more. So people who know stuff that I haven't mentioned, please send it to me in the comments. And if it's something that is useful for others beyond me, I'll share that. If it's only useful to me, I'm not going to share that. But thank you very much. I hope you have fun making this exploration into improvisational music. The number one most important thing I've gotten out of this is some things you do for the experience, the journey, the means, not the end. The means is the end in itself. And for me, a lot of this has to do with that. Thank you for watching, and enjoy making music.